Saturday's game against SMU is a must-win for the Louisville Cardinals.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome into this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I want to take this time to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked On Louisville, free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Saturday's game against the SMU Mustangs is a must-win for the Louisville Cardinals. Jeff Brom's team 3-1, looking to really get going here in ACC play as we get closer to some huge matchups later on in the schedule. We'll discuss the takeaways from the ACC in Week 6, the biggest risers, biggest fallers, games to watch this weekend, and much more. And the basketball schedule has been released. There's a couple things that really stand out to me about the basketball schedule, and we'll break that down at the conclusion of the show. Louisville now turns the page after a gut-wrenching loss to Notre Dame. They're 3-1 on the season, fell to 22nd in the AP poll, which I thought was pretty interesting, which I don't disagree that it's probably where the team should be right now, but just look at the principle of it. The number 15 team loses by 7 on the road to number 16, and they fall down 7 spots. Meanwhile, the number 6 team in the country loses to an unranked team, and they fall down 6 spots. Don't get me started. It is what it is. But Louisville is now turning the page. They're getting into the full swing of ACC play. They begin with the SMU Mustangs. And let me just say, I don't really like to put this severe of a point of view out there, but I think it's true. This is a must-win game for the Louisville Cardinals. Jeff Brom's team cannot afford to lose this game. SMU comes into this matchup having sort of revitalized the season. Early on, it was really rough. Like, they barely beat a bad Nevada team. They lost to BYU, which doesn't really look all that bad right now because BYU is a ranked team and they're playing really well. And then they have 2 blowout victories against TCU and Florida State. SMU 4-1 overall, 1-0 in conference play. When I looked at the spread when it opened up, it was 6.5. So that just goes to show you that it's not that large of a difference. Like, SMU, once again, is starting to meet like the preseason expectations that I had, that they were going to be a very good team in the ACC. Now, whether or not they're contending for the conference, well, I mean, obviously that's still to be determined, right? But I do think that they were better than people gave them credit for. Like, people completely wrote them off after that Nevada game. Then they lost to BYU. Their quarterback got benched, and I'm like, guys, let's pump the brakes here a little bit and let's wait to see just how good SMU is able to bounce back. And it looks like that they've done so. Now, how good is TCU? How good is Florida State? Well, I can speak to the latter by saying that not good at all. Florida State is really not good whatsoever. Louisville still is a 6.5-point favorite over SMU. They're a minus 240 money line, and the over is 56.5 in this game. That is according to the title sponsor of the show, FanDuel. But as it relates to where we're at in overall conference play, you're 1-0. And the best way to paint the picture for a certain matchup with a certain team is to discuss what is at stake. And it all kind of comes down to this being a must-win game. And I guess you could say that that's a little bit redundant because I mentioned yesterday that Louisville needs to run the table in the ACC and split one of Miami and Clemson. So by default, that means, of course, this has to be a must-win game, but it's not the only must-win game. It deserves a little bit more attention because the Cardinals are coming off of a loss, and you desperately need to turn that momentum and get back on the right track, because losing this game really puts you in a tough situation. The longer you can go without a conference loss, the better your chances are of getting to the ACC championship game. If you win this game, again, on paper, you were supposed to. Depending on how you win this game, it might be somewhat of a statement victory. I don't know how much, considering that you're almost a touchdown favorite. SMU is 4-1. Unfortunately, the national perception of the Mustangs probably isn't the greatest, just because they haven't really shown much. But then again, this goes back to my belief that Rhett Lashley is a really good play caller. They have a really solid offense. I mean, you look at the offense, they have the loss against BYU was 18-15. Since then, 66 points against TCU, 42 against Florida State. And yes, you have to take into consideration, well, just how good are those opponents. But ever since Kevin Jennings became the starting quarterback for SMU, they've been pretty solid. He has 6 touchdowns to 1 interceptions, 63% completion percentage, which isn't really the greatest, but 733 passing yards. He's averaging about 7.9 yards per completion. Brashard Smith has 500 or over 500 yards already, 7.3 yards per carry. He's got 7 touchdowns. He's the player definitely that you have to watch for. And then RJ Maryland, a player before the season we talked about as a tight end, being one of the better players at the position in conference play. He leads the Mustangs not only in receptions, but receiving touchdowns and receptions as a whole. Receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. So I think that this offense doesn't get enough credit for how good they can be. Defensively, still things that are being worked out. They brought their defensive coordinator back on a team that was really good last year in the American Athletic Conference, but better teams that you were playing this season, and you just lost one of your rotational cornerbacks to redshirting. We're starting to see this trend in college football where players are not playing over 4 games in the redshirting, with obviously the intent to eventually transfer. That's just sort of the reality that we are living in 2024 in the college football landscape. But that does help Louisville out. A couple of injury situations that we're watching for. Is Quincy Riley going to be back? What is the status of some other players that you're focusing on that got hurt in that loss to Notre Dame? So on and so forth. But back to the what's at stake discussion. If you win this game, you'll have beaten a team that you were supposed to beat. But then again, it's more so the conference implications. Like you give SMU you give SMU their first conference loss. You give them another loss on their schedule, but you hold the head-to-head tiebreaker, because you look at their schedule for the rest of the season. If SMU doesn't have to play Clemson, they don't have to play Miami. Like they're at Stanford, at Duke, versus Pittsburgh, versus Boston College, at Virginia, versus California. Now, could they run the table in the ACC? Likely. I don't think it's probable. But in the same sentence, we still don't know how good Pittsburgh is. We don't know how good Boston College with Thomas Castellanos is. We don't know how good California is. Virginia and Stanford and Duke, all 3 of those are on the road. So this might be a moot point. We could be talking about SMU at the end of the season, and maybe they're 7-5 overall, and they've got multiple conference losses, and it doesn't matter. But then again, you also have to play the devil's advocate. And I do believe that SMU, like Georgia Tech, is better than what people give them credit for. This is a great opportunity for Louisville to sort of stop the bleeding and turn the momentum, turn the tide, get a really solid victory, build the vibes back up, and then go on the road to Virginia. That's the main thing here. Is the season isn't over, but you have to switch the momentum right now. If you were to lose this game, you continue your skid. You make it really challenging at that point to get into the ACC championship game unless Clemson and Miami trip up somewhere. You will go unranked. the momentum you built up the first couple weeks of the season will completely be wiped out, and you're being forced to have to pick up the pieces and figure out, well, what the hell are we supposed to expect for the rest of the season? Like, the perception continually goes down. Losing this game against SMU could be disastrous for Louisville's postseason chances if they have the aspirations of ultimately getting back to Charlotte, winning that game, and making the inaugural 12-team college football playoff. So it's sort of like Georgia Tech. You really just need to give SMU their first conference loss. You need to get that head-to-head tiebreaker. And you just need to win this game. Like, this is a must-win game. There is a ton of urgency for a Louisville team that's supposed to be really good on paper. There's still high hopes across the city for this team, but they have to win this game. They have to get back in the win column. They have to show that they're legit. So I really don't know what else to say other than that, is that this is a dire situation for the Louisville Cardinals, and they need to win this game. The ACC, pretty interesting this past weekend. Duke was able to defeat North Carolina, come back and defeat North Carolina. Florida State continually showed that they are in a free fall. And again, SMU rising up the board. We'll give our ACC takeaways and much more for Week 6 coming up on the next segment of Locked on Louisville. Today's episode of the show is Roy. Roy is a new platform that lets fans make contributions directly to their favorite athletes. Download Roy for iOS or Android and enter referral code LOCKEDON, and you'll be automatically entered into a sweepstakes to win $5,000 cash. No purchase necessary, void where prohibited. Get off the sidelines and into the NIL game with Roy. Support the players and change the game with Roy. Cardinal fans, thanks again for making Locked on Louisville your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked on Louisville, free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. It's time to recap what happened in ACC play for Week 5, discuss Week 6, the 3 matchups to watch for across the conference play, main storylines, biggest risers and fallers, and much, much more. The main storyline for this past week was the Friday night game. Virginia Tech held the lead against Miami for a long time until they didn't. And the Hurricanes took the lead, and there was a controversial play at the very end where Virginia Tech seemingly had completed a Hail Mary. After review, it was reversed. Miami continues to be undefeated, now at 5-0, and they got their first ACC win. I think it just continually shows that Miami is human and that they can be beaten. Like, they're not impossible to defeat, but you have to play a good game against them. You have to keep it clean and not make many mistakes. And just goes to show you that, yes, they could be beaten, but they also are a pretty solid team. North Carolina, 17-0 halftime lead. Duke, 21-3 advantage in the second half to come out victorious over the Tar Heels. Duke now 5-0. 1-0 in ACC play. They are the biggest riser from this week, along with the SMU Mustangs, who absolutely demolished Florida State. Both of these teams undefeated in conference play, and they will look ahead to some pretty tough matchups in Week 6 to try to make that undefeated streak stay alive. The biggest fallers this week, Florida State. Obviously, it feels like every week it's redundant that we mention them. They should be in a different category called the biggest free fallers. And it's very ugly right now with the Seminoles. The other one is Stanford. I was really hoping that Stanford would put up a big contest against Clemson. This was after they had defeated Syracuse last week on the road, and Stanford lost 40-14. Really wasn't much of a game at all. Clemson opened up 10-0 in the first quarter. Cade Klubnik was really good, 15-31, 255, and 4 touchdowns. Overall, Stanford still just having to continually prove themselves, but SMU, Duke, my biggest risers. Stanford, Florida State, my biggest fallers. Let's look at the 3 matchups this upcoming week, ones that you should be paying attention to. The first one is Boston College at Virginia, Saturday noon kickoff down in Charlottesville. I'm not sure the status of Thomas Castellanos at this point. If he is playing, that gives them obviously a huge opportunity. But there hasn't been any talk of it yet. It is still only Tuesday. He missed the game against Western Kentucky. They barely won. So if they go to Virginia without Thomas Castellanos, it's probably going to be an uphill battle for Bill O'Brien's team. But Virginia is also a team sitting out right now at 3-1, 1-0 in ACC play. Anthony Calandria and company are looking to make a statement and continually show that they are much, much improved from last season. So Boston College at Virginia, the first game that I am watching this weekend. Next up is Duke at Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech, one of the better teams in the ACC, in my opinion. It doesn't really show right now with their 1-2 conference record, but they will host a Duke team that frankly, y'all, I'm still not sold on the Blue Devils. Like their strength of schedule has not been good. They played Elon, Northwestern, UConn, Middle Tennessee State, and North Carolina. They blew out Middle Tennessee State. They beat Elon, but they edged out victories against Northwestern, UConn, and the Tar Heels, and this was a UNC team that really hasn't been all that good. Duke will have their fair share of tests when they play Miami later in the season. They'll play Virginia Tech, NC State, SMU, but they're at Georgia Tech this weekend. So I guess this is a chance for Manny Diaz's team, Malik Murphy and company, to say, hey, look, hold on a second. Watch what we do against Georgia Tech. If they get a win against the Rambling Wreck, I think that that's a pretty good step in the right direction to really making sure that they justify themselves as maybe an ACC contender. I just don't feel that way at the moment. The final game is College Game Day, 10:30 Eastern kickoff. California 3-1, 0-1 in conference play, hosting the 8th-ranked Miami Hurricanes, 5-0, 1-0 in conference play. Cal suffered the first loss of the season at Florida State. They're looking to bounce back against Miami. Miami is obviously undefeated. They're looking to continue their undefeated stretch in conference play and rise up the national rankings. California should be the team that all Louisville fans cheer for the most this weekend. Simply put, any loss for Miami and Clemson is a good loss for the sake of the Louisville Cardinals, because we mentioned, the chance to get to Charlotte. The opportunities for Clemson and Miami to slip up really don't seem to be that prevalent, right? They have to be, they have to probably get upset along the way. If Cal, who has been a weird team, but they did defeat Auburn at home. They defeated Auburn on the road. We'll see. But California should be the team that you cheer for. Those are the three games to focus on. I know as tough as it is for Louisville fans to do, Louisville fans need to cheer for Florida State to defeat Clemson. Goes back to the same situation with Miami. Also, Syracuse at UNLV. UNLV had their quarterback transfer, but it didn't matter because they got a blowout victory over Florida State. They will host Syracuse this weekend. UNLV is ranked, so that'll be an interesting one to watch for. Pitt at North Carolina. Pitt hasn't played a conference game, so again, I'm not too high on both of these teams, but could be some interesting opportunities. Wake Forest at NC State, not really anything that moves me. It's on the CW network, so I'm not even going to be watching it. Virginia Tech at Stanford, again, not one that I'm going to be paying much attention to. So 3 matchups to watch for: Boston College at Virginia, Duke at Georgia Tech, and Miami at Cal. Hopefully by this time next week, we are able to discuss maybe Clemson or Miami losing. Probably not, but hey, one can hope, right? The main thing is we need Louisville to be victorious over SMU. That's enough football talk for the day. We haven't talked about basketball a ton. We've talked about basketball recruiting here and there, but not much basketball. Louisville is about a month away from the season. The full schedule has been released. December is going to be absolutely brutal. We'll explain why coming up here on the next segment. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a large return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. What better way to do that than this weekend? Louisville, a 6.5-point favorite over the SMU Mustangs. Some good player props. I would venture into looking at the over for both Jamari Johnson and Colin Lacey. Gut feeling is I feel like they're both going to have a huge game. So go to FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook, to check it out. And into the final segment of this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast, we're talking about basketball. And I don't know about you all, is the more and more time that the season, the more and more time it takes for the season to get here, the more and more antsy I am. Like we saw what happened in the Bahamas, and immediately I was like, okay, I'm ready for the season. This season needs to start now. Unfortunately, we had to wait about 3, maybe 4 months. The season will start on November 4th, which is a little over a month away. But the most notable thing is the full schedule for the 2024-2025 campaign has been released. There are 3 main notable takeaways from this. For starters, it's a rough non-conference slate. Louisville is going to be tested early and often. Second game of the season, they will host Tennessee. Tennessee with Rick Barnes is usually a very solid opponent. They will go to the battle for Atlantis. And the first game that they'll play is against the Indiana Hoosiers. Now, that's always a pretty interesting, that's always a pretty interesting matchup. It's one of those unsung rivalries that you just love to watch. And also in that field, like they'll play either West Virginia or Gonzaga after that. And that's going to be a tough game. And if they make it a little further, Oklahoma, Providence, Davidson, and Arizona. So all 8 teams in the field are pretty quality, and you'll learn a lot about Louisville early on. It doesn't stop there, however. You look at the rest of the non-conference slate. Bellarmine usually is a tough mid-major opponent. Ole Miss in the ACC-SEC Challenge. You will have Kentucky, and overall, that's a pretty tough non-conference slate. You've got 3 SEC teams on that schedule. You've got at least 1 Big Ten team, either West Virginia or Gonzaga, and then Bellarmine and Morehead State, who seems to be like they could be tough to play as well. So rough non-conference slate. But December's going to be brutal. December's going to be really challenging, y'all. We're going to learn a lot about this team, and it's going to take some time for this brand new squad with all new players to mesh. But let's hope it happens sooner rather than later, because December is unforgiving as it gets. Let's look at December. They open up at home in the ACC-SEC Challenge against Chris Beard and Ole Miss. Immediately after that, you have your first conference game. Duke will come to town. You'll play UTEP after that. The next weekend, at Kentucky. Always going to be a tough matchup there. A week off at Florida State, another conference opponent, which can be challenging to play on the road there. And then you have Eastern Kentucky, who knows what they're going to look like. But Ole Miss, Duke, Kentucky, Florida State in December. People say, well, I mean, how tough is that? There's the potential that all 3 of those teams might be ranked. I don't know about Florida State, but Duke, Kentucky, and Mississippi could all be ranked. So that's coming off of the trip to the Bahamas. Like, you don't get much time to rest at all. Like, you come back from the Bahamas or Atlantis, and boom, the very next week, that Tuesday, you're playing against Mississippi. So you've got to really focus on gelling early on, because these are opportunities for Louisville to build up that postseason resume going into year 1 under Pat Kelsey. The final takeaway here is looking at the conference slate. It's really hard to kind of break it down month by month, but there are 4 teams that Louisville does play twice honestly, it's sort of the usual suspects. Like Virginia, you will play twice in the month of January. So unlike, usually you'll play them once in January and then you'll play them again in March. You're playing them pretty close back to back. You'll play at Virginia January 4th, then you'll host Virginia January 18th. So if you're looking for the new teams being added to the ACC to help you escape playing Tony Bennett's system, well, unfortunately, I have some bad news. You will play North Carolina. Looks like actually playing North Carolina only once, so it might be 3 teams that you will play twice. Okay, so I stand completely corrected. I'm sorry about that. You play 3 teams twice. UNC, you only play once. When I was looking at this on the app, I guess for some reason it showed in December and January at the same time. But you will play North Carolina on January 1st. You'll host the Tar Heels. You won't play them again unless you play them in conference play. You only play Duke once. So put it this way. You get Duke and North Carolina already out of the way. And you'll get Virginia out of the way. You will play Florida State twice. You have that game in December where you'll go to Tallahassee to play. You will host the Seminoles. I'm wasting I'm wasting too much time on getting tripped up over my words. I know there's some people that listen to this show and they just love to point out when I slip up on my words. Like speaking for 30 minutes at a time is the easiest thing to do. But some people will point it out because it is what it is. The last team, see, I'm in my own head now. The last team that they will play twice is Pittsburgh. They will host Pittsburgh on March 1st. They will go to Pittsburgh earlier in the season. That's a game on January 11th. But looking at the conference slate as a whole, it's what you would expect. It's going to be a challenging conference slate, but you do get Duke and North Carolina out of the way. Clemson is out of the way early. Syracuse on the road. Virginia is out of the way after January. February is going to be an interesting slate. Miami, and then you have 2 road games at NC State and Notre Dame. Florida State at home, at Virginia Tech. Pittsburgh at home. Cal and Stanford to close out the season. So I'm really looking forward to the season where we don't just have to count down the games for the season to be over. I'm looking forward to getting back to the postseason. John Rothstein was in attendance at practice earlier on Tuesday at Louisville, and he said Louisville was a bubble team. I respect his opinion, but I know that this team has to gel. But truthfully, I think that the Cardinals are going to be better than a bubble team. I think they're going to be far better than a bubble team. And obviously, we'll discuss as we get closer and closer to the season. But that is going to wrap up this Tuesday edition of the show. Everyone have a great day. We will see you right back here